Welcome back, Cold War 5 listeners. I'm today's host, Andrew Hunter, and I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Dr. Kent Hughes. Dr. Hughes is the director of the program on Science, Technology, America, and the Global Economy at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He is the former director of the center's program on America and the Global Economy, prior to which he served as the Associate Deputy Secretary of the Department of Commerce during the Clinton administration, and also as the president of the Private Sector Council on Competitiveness in a number of senior positions within the U.S. Congress and at the Urban Law Center. Dr. Hughes holds a Ph.D. in economics from Washington University, a Bachelor of Laws from Harvard Law School, and a B.A. in Political and Economic Institutions from Yale University. He is author of multiple publications, including in 2005 his Building the Next American Century, The Past and Future of American Economic Competitiveness, in which he reflects on the partnerships between public and private sector during the 1980s and 1990s, and looks forward to the future of American competitiveness in an increasingly competitive world. Dr. Hughes is an authority on questions of international economics, law, and relations. It's a pleasure to have you on, Dr. Hughes, and I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Andrew, very much. And it's a pleasure to be part of this entire podcast initiative. I have been also an adjunct professor for Boston University for BU students studying here in Washington. And over time, I've been increasingly impressed with not only their quality, but their curiosity and their interest. And clearly, Andrew is carrying that tradition forward.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Dr. Hughes. We appreciate that here at Cold War 5. We're doing our best to carry on that tradition here at Cold War 5 and at Boston University. So let's get started. Today's episode is labeled Competitive Development Economics. We'll be looking into the various approaches to development economics, the ways in which global economic development policy fit into larger strategic visions, and we'll be speaking on the two major economic development systems, if you will, the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Innovation and China's Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative, of course, being China's system of investments and loans given out across the world, generally towards hard infrastructure and trade-related structures as a means to strengthen China's supply lines and build out relationships and influence. The Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Innovation, on the other hand, is thought by many to be the U.S. allied response to the BRI. It focuses much or all of its $600 billion fund towards the infrastructure needs of the Indo-Pacific region specifically. So, Dr. Hughes, can you introduce us in more detail to these economic development systems? First, what are the infrastructure needs of the Indo-Pacific, and how is the G7 addressing them? And second, how does this strategy compare to that of China in terms of geographic, sectoral, and general strategic focus?
Well, I think the needs are something we should spend some time thinking about. It's not only the traditional needs. If you talk to a development economist and they'll say, what would she do for a largely agricultural economy? And the answer would be, have something like our own extension service, bringing new technologies, new advice to small farmers, but also roads, so you can get to the market. But the Belt and Road Initiative and the Indo-Pacific Initiative really go beyond that. They're looking also at the possibility of the kind of infrastructure that will foster innovation. So you have generally, take India as a good example. They have lots of traditional infrastructure needs, but they're intent on being a major innovator as well. And that demands not only the laboratories and so forth, but also a commitment to the kind of education that lays the basis for a 21st century economy. The Chinese have been very aggressive and very effective in investments, not only in the Asia-Pacific region, but also in Africa and Latin America. So you will find, for instance, when Lula, the president of Brazil, made a recent trip to Beijing, and he was very aware that Beijing is a major market for Brazil in terms of iron and soybeans and beef and so forth, but also potentially the source of investment capital. The Brazilians, as an example, would say they have the most efficient agriculture from the row to the fence. And it's the infrastructure beyond that that holds them back. And I think that's true too of some of the African countries. And then, of course, in Asia, you have major economies that are intent on not only making sure they're part of these large markets in China and elsewhere, but they want to very much themselves move into the future economy. The current effort in the advanced world, in the industrial world, to realign their supply chains has opened up opportunities for countries not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but also in Latin America and elsewhere, where they can be a part of these advanced supply chains, which means they have to be part of the innovation economy and the new 21st century education economy.
Absolutely. And continuing on that idea of the 21st century innovation economy, something you mentioned in a recent publication of yours labeled Building Up Competitiveness and the G7's infrastructure ambitions was that whereas China has focused much of its funding on traditional infrastructure projects such as ports, roads, etc., the G7 is building up new age infrastructure such as high-speed internet and other communication-driven projects. So how do these foci play into the larger strategic visions of the G7 and of China, and do they vary country by country or region by region?
Well, I think one of the things you mentioned, the ICT era, is something that really fits in a development plan everywhere in the world. People often point to Kenya as an example, how they have raced ahead with using their mobile phones as a way of investing, saving, moving their banking accounts and so forth. So you look at other countries where maybe the innovations take place, but on the platform of the internet. So I think those are all kind of infrastructure that will be of interest all around the world. The other question that we don't talk about enough is that often with regard to World Bank loans or American or European or Japanese loans, there's an emphasis on other elements. We want to avoid any kind of corruption. We want to have human rights. We don't want to damage the environment. We don't want to have exploited labor. And sometimes that makes it difficult for some less democratic administrations around the world to be interested. I heard one leader from Africa asking for the comparison between, let's say, the G7 kind of approach they expected and the Belt and Road Initiative. And they said, well, with the Belt and Road Initiative, what we got was a new stadium or a new dam or a new highway. But what we got from the Americans was a lecture on what we ought to do. And so I think that's something that is a challenge for us, because many people who are maybe not holding up the same values that we want, but nonetheless are in real serious need for infrastructure investment. So that's something we'll have to wrestle with over the coming years.
And not only that, from what I understand, whereas China has made much or all of its investments from the government or from publicly supported corporations, as it does based on the structure of its economy, the G7 has focused on bringing in private sector partners and trying to develop profit incentives. So there's a question, right, about how willing private sector entities will be to participate in this process and whether this strategy will be sustainable.
That's a very good question. That the Europe, the Japan, the United States may per capita have much more wealth than China does. Mm-hmm. But China has the ability to mobilize its entire wealth on a national purpose. That's less true. It's more complicated. You can look at the United States, where we have Silicon Valley, and we have Silicon Valleys that are now grown up all across the country. We've got very creative companies, but at the same time, it's very difficult to get them to do what we may or may not think is the national purpose. So that's another challenge we face, and it's a difference in dealing with China. The other reality, of course, is that this is a Cold War, some people think, some people use that phrase, but it's dramatically different than our relationship with the Soviet Union. That the US, Chinese, and other economies around the world are very much intertwined. This was not true with regard to the Soviet Union. So it's a more complicated kind of competition and cooperation than we faced in earlier periods.
Building off of that point, you mentioned that many people say that we're in some sort of new Cold War. Can you speak on whether and how these various development economic systems are oriented under a larger strategic vision in the interest of global competition with regard to the economy, with regard to hard power, and with regard to diplomacy as well, from the perspective of the G7 and from the perspective of China?
Mm-hmm. Well, Andrew, I think you're right that there's no question that at least in my mind, what the G7 chose to do and other initiatives that you see are to some extent a response to China's rise and China's Belt and Road Initiative and China's really long-term strategy for everything from diplomacy to semiconductors to pharmaceuticals and so forth. So I think that is something that is part of what's going on. And of course, there is the question of diplomatic force as well. If you notice in the United Nations that many of the countries from what people call the Global South did not condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They also are, in some cases, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Chile, other Chile is not really a developing country so much, but you have situations in which countries that need a lot of infrastructure and other elements of a growth strategy, but are home to the kind of minerals that are absolutely necessary for a shift to green energy, to a shift to new kinds of batteries, new kinds of transportation. So there's that element as well, that to pursue the commitments that have been made at the various environmental summits, it does look as though we're going to need access to lithium and cobalt and some other rare earths. And that also influences this kind of competition. Right now, in terms of lithium, a good piece of it comes from China, but in terms of processing the lithium, it may be something like 80%. So all of that is part of what people are thinking of, and a concern that economic dependence can be used for political influence. So unlike a situation where you're not supposed to, let's say, I don't like what you're doing, I'm going to put a tariff on your particular kind of export. Australia ran into this problem when they suggested, why don't we take a look at whether the COVID-19 actually leaked from the lab, or was it from a wet market in downtown Wuhan? And then China responded by imposing tariffs on Australian wine, which is a shame because it's quite good, but also on other elements. So that's why I think there's been a bit more of a move that is linked to not being too dependent for critical items on other countries.
And beyond those rare earth minerals, which, from the perspective of the United States, which critical elements are we speaking of?
Well, I think the recent speech by Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor, where he talked about what was our, let's say, industrial policy moving forward. And he talked about a small garden and a high fence, that there were certain technologies that were of great concern with regard to national security. They also, as a matter of fact, have an enormous impact on the future economy. So you're looking at quantum computing, artificial intelligence, some of the pharmaceutical developments. So all of those things are areas in which almost every industrial country wants to have a presence. If you looked at China's Made in China 2025, where they have basically a list of 10 areas in which they want to be a major player and not dependent on other countries, it's kind of a list that you'd find in Japan or South Korea or Europe or North America. So I think that that's another element of competition. If we have a world in which we really all competed to be innovative and educated, well, that might be a pretty good race to have everybody run. But there are other elements, of course, that seem to creep into this, and that's a question of national security, national dominance, and so forth. I think China wants to see itself as the leading country and the leading system. I once, in fact, it was one of these Boston University classes. One of the students in making his presentation showed a film with Xi Jinping giving a talk about development. And he said, among other things, if you want to develop, we have the model, follow our model. But it was also an inspirational kind of talk. It's something that you might have thought that Jack Kennedy or Ronald Reagan would have given, saying, we want to help the world. We want to make this a better world and so forth. So there are all of these elements that are tied together. Global leadership, which can be both values oriented as well as territorial and industrial.
And on that question of global hegemony and competition between the US and China, comparing China and the US in their economic sustainability and in their capacity for long-term global competition, where are their vulnerabilities and where are their strengths? Specifically, I think it's important to touch on strength of supply chains, food imports, energy imports. Much of the strength of the U.S. economy comes from its self-sufficiency, especially when you're considering North America in general, whereas others critique China for being a net energy importer, for being an importer of cereal, wheat, etc.
Yes, so starting with China, I would say that you're quite right to identify their need to import energy and their need to import food. It's one of the explanations for the growing closeness between China and Russia, that Russia has just those two items which it produces with some efficiency, and you can see that China is looking at Siberia and saying, my, all that oil and gas up there, and now it's coming in our direction. So I think that is a concern that they have. They also have some economic difficulties right now. The headlines are all about China's level of debt. Most of the debt is owed to themselves, so that's a very different situation than where you have international debt. But it's also something that they have relied on as a kind of stimulus for the economy, that the whole infrastructure and the housing sector have been buoyed. All the small cities, and even, well, a small city in China is 1 million people or so, that they really have to sell local land to keep their budgets going. So they need that has to be straightened out. And suddenly they have a slowing growth rate, although if they say, well, we're only going to grow 5%, well, that sounds pretty good to most people. But the era of 10% a year compounded for 30 years is almost surely behind us. They also have right now an unemployment problem, particularly for younger people, that they've been very successful in creating new universities, and universities that will prepare people for just this era we're talking about, the higher tech area where it demands more education and so forth. But suddenly you have a large number of young people without jobs. And the official figure before they stopped giving them was about 10% unemployment for that, I think, 18 to 25 cohort of people that left college or they left school. And other people think that there's a higher, that many of them are now working in jobs for which they're over-prepared. Or there was this movement called lying flat. They're just going to stay at home and not take any of these awful jobs. So that is a challenge. But I think China has two characteristics that are real strengths. One, it has the habit of long-term strategy. That if you look at semiconductors, they didn't just learn to make semiconductors, they wanted to manufacture the entire supply chain, just as they have done, let's say, with solar panels or with batteries or with EV cars. So that longer term perspective and being able to pursue it is a real strength for them. In the US case, we are blessed with the fact that we're essentially, in terms of food, we're largely self-dependent. And in terms of oil and gas, suddenly now we are a net exporter. It's really remarkable when you think of how back to the period in the 1970s when we had two big oil crises. The weakness, I think, for the U.S., well, let me go back to China for one more thing. They have great confidence in their past and their future. That I had a research assistant on the book I wrote recently, which is going to say I did something on the Chinese growth strategy. If anybody's interested, they can go to the Kissinger Institute at the Wilson Center and download a copy. It's easy. It's not horribly long, so you can get through it quickly.
And what was the name of that book?
It's called The Middle Kingdom at Center Stage, China's Past and Future Growth Strategy. And it still, I think, applies to what they're doing and want to do today. But I had a young Chinese woman as a research assistant, and she read an early copy, and she said, but you didn't mention the century of humiliation. So it's widely accepted that there were 100 years when China didn't do well, and part of it was Britain's fault, and part of it was their own fault, of course. But they have that sense of, now we're back. We were always the great power. We're going to be that again. We're going to be the world leader. You have now an education system there, which is very demanding, and they increasingly do well on these international tests. There's a program on international student assessment run by the OECD, which is kind of a club for rich countries. And China does very well and will do better. This is an area, I think, of weakness in the United States, that we are doing two things that really need looking at. If you look at that in that study of where people at age 15 are in terms of mathematics and reading and science, the US is kind of mediocre, right stuck in the middle, which is a way of saying because we have some outstanding high schools, that there are many American students that are right at the top of that age group, but it suggests that a lot of people aren't even at the average level, and we can't afford that. And there's been a sudden revolution in talking about education here, where people are moving back to phonics, which is the science apparently shows that's a better way to learn to read. And then we don't have that kind of national determination. One of the strengths of a federal system is we have laboratories of democracy. One of the weaknesses is that we can't say, we've got a real problem in education. Why don't we recognize the pandemic set a lot of students back? Let's have a national summer school program, or let's have a national education corps, something like that. We're slow to do those kinds of things, and it's something we need to correct.
Much of your work at the Wilson Center has actually focused on this idea, on the question of American competitiveness, on its capacity for advanced manufacturing, for lifelong learning, as you put it. Are you optimistic about America's ability to maintain its position on the world stage and maintain its competitiveness over the foreseeable future?
Well, I am by nature an optimist, so I probably have a bias to saying, yes, of course we can do it. And I look back over the really starting with World War II, where the U.S. just turned on a dime. And there was a whole period where I think that we only made 5 or 6 cars for consumers. And it was an enormous national effort. And we reacted that way again with regard to Sputnik. You may remember in the late 50s, Russia was the first country to put a satellite in orbit. And this was a shock. It was partly a national security reaction, partly it was a blow to national pride. Hey, wait a minute, we're supposed to be doing that kind of thing. And as a result, we developed new institutions. We put enormous emphasis on education. Knew a reporter who was job right after Sputnik was covering school boards in Massachusetts. And they all felt that it was critical to study mathematics and science and foreign languages because this was a global struggle. So again, we had a similar kind of reaction, not as extreme, but similar, when we faced the challenge of a recovered Japan and Germany in the economic realm. And that again changed the way American companies did business, and it changed a number of our own institutions to bring innovation closer to the market. Now I think you're seeing again a kind of reaction to the challenge of China. And you have, for instance, the CHIPS Act that recently passed the Congress, $57 billion, part of which goes to encouraging and incentivizing the making of semiconductors here, but also putting more money into research. And I think that has started the step toward thinking, well, we really have to have a concerted effort in some of these areas. Another example is the recent infrastructure bill that passed. It's the first major national effort on infrastructure since President Eisenhower created the interstate highway system. So we do seem to be, say, pulling up our socks and getting ready for a more complicated world. But we do still have this sense that we need to think about the rest of the world and how that's going and what are we going to do about water shortages, food shortages. You can't have a world in which many people go to bed hungry. It's partly many Americans feel that's, if we're fortunate enough to be here, my grandparents got on the right boat. I'm always thankful for that. And we've got to do our effort to raise not only ourselves, but those that need some raising up too.
You mentioned national pride and touched on national outlook and strategy as well. There's been quite an internal shift between the Trump administration and the Biden administration with respect to tone, with respect to politics. Some would say that the outward focus of the two administrations have actually been quite consistent, say with bringing American manufacturing back to the mainland, prioritizing American industry. We can see that in the Biden administration's infrastructure bill, in its CHIPS Act, and the pressure it applies on China. Do you agree with this notion? Do you see a consistent overarching strategy between the two administrations, even if their messaging is quite different? And do you see this strategy continuing throughout the next administrations, or do you think that there is actually little substantive overlap between their foreign policies?
Well, I think the emphasis on manufacturing in America is something that's going to be with us. I think that often when people talk about manufacturing, they say, but look, you have the reality of all kinds of technical changes. You go into an auto plant today and there's nobody working on the assembly line, it's all robots. But they neglect how critical manufacturing is for the whole chain of innovation that goes. It's a major demand for innovation. Much of the overall investment in research and development comes from the auto sector or manufacturing more generally. So I think that is going to continue. There are a couple things that the Trump administration did that don't get that much attention. That in July of 2017, the Trump administration asked everybody to look at what is the nature of the defense industrial base, including all the civilian companies that participated. And I think that was that gives you the basis of saying we're really worried about this piece. We can't depend on country X to provide this piece, so we'll need to do something about trying to find another source or have one on our own. The same is true in the development area, that the Trump administration took parts of AID, the development office, and put it together, the Office of Overseas Private Investment, and created the Development Finance Corporation. And it's, I think, a good idea. It's designed to have a facility that will invest in the kind of infrastructure in the developing world. But it's only $60 billion. So it's not up to the trillion. And the challenge for us is to find the incentives that will attract some of the American private corporations, which are so advanced and effective and innovative, into being part of that picture. And they're, I think, still working on that. The US does have, I think, the flexibility in the corporate world where you'll have a Google, let's say, or another high-tech company, and they'll give people 10 or 20% of their time just to think of new ideas. We have a very vibrant venture capital system. We have even, it's an awful thing to say that bankruptcy is an advantage, but we do have an ability for people who went bankrupt. The company disappears, but the people don't disappear. And often you find then people move on to the next venture. People quote a venture capitalist here as saying, I don't want to hire anybody that hasn't gone bankrupt once or hasn't failed once, because they look at failure as a learning experience. And that's kind of a cultural advantage for us.
How would you characterize then the Biden administration's policies towards China? It's quite relevant right now, actually, considering that tomorrow, I think, President Biden and Xi are meeting in San Francisco, my hometown, and many of the questions we're talking about today with regard to global economic development policies, cooperation versus competition between the two great powers are going to be discussed. So how would you characterize the Biden approach to the China question?
Well, I think from our point of view, of course, everyone in Washington, D.C. is grieving that the pandas have gone. It's
Even out here in Boston, we are as well.
So I think from the U.S. point of view, Biden wants two things. One is a concern that we don't have a way of immediately responding to what might be an accident. Boat runs into another boat. A plane runs into another plane. Or there's something like that, which may not be of any consequence, might not be intentional, but it can escalate. So you may remember, or you probably don't remember, but you probably read about the red telephone that existed between the US and the Soviet Union. So I think they want to have something where there's a more general conversation between the militaries of the two countries. And that's just really a focus on stability and peace. The other is the continuing concern about how do we grow together, where there's been such a pattern of Chinese borrowing, let's say, of all of our technology, which is billions and billions of dollars every year. And it sort of then this puts American companies at a disadvantage. And the third thing I think he would look for is some assurance from China that they're not going to be quite as arbitrary as they have been with putting down new regulations. That if you read the reports of the European Chamber of Commerce in China and the American Chamber of Commerce in China, both of them talk about we don't feel as welcome as we used to. From Xi's point of view, I'm sure he's interested in having some degree of peaceful stability too. But he also, I think, is interested, given the short-term troubles that they're having in China in the economy, he would like to continue to be attractive to Western investment. And by that, I really mean Korean, Japanese. So I think that those are two things that if they work out, could be of a shared benefit. But there's been a lot of questioning and a lot of animosity and a sensitivity in China when there were questions about, well, maybe the COVID did really, come out of the lab. Who knows? I mean, our intelligence services split. Something it did, something it didn't. I know there was some concern early on that China was doing a lot of experiments in a level 2 lab. Well, if you go to Fort Detrick, they have a level 4 lab is where you would do work on Ebola or something like that. So I think but there's a potential combination. At the same time, the U.S. has to recognize, and I think Biden does, and I think Trump, were he to be reelected, does too, that there really is a competition between the two. And the competition is in part for influence and so forth, but also there's a fundamental systemic difference that we have lots of things to not celebrate: the treatment of Native Americans in the past, the treatment of the whole slavery regime that in the South and then lasted really until was fully resolved until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So, but on the other hand, I think we have to have a talk about what kind of rules of the road we're going to have. I think Henry Kissinger would say we ought to get together and talk about artificial intelligence, both enormous benefits in terms of productivity growth, solving new disease problems and so forth, but at the same time could be misused. And we need to have some rules of the road. And we'll see if China is amenable to that.
There's much talk about the decoupling of the two economies. Do you think that's a trend that's likely to continue, especially, of course, involving industries of importance to national security? Or do you see the two economies actually maintaining their linkages over the next years and decades, let's say?
No, I think that for certain key elements where there's both an implication for national security, but also for the whole future of your economy, that the US and China and increasingly Europe and Japan and so forth will start to invest more and more in artificial intelligence and in quantum computing and some of the advanced work in pharmaceuticals. I think that that's natural. I don't think that either the US or China will become dependent on the other country for, let's say, quantum computing. So, but on the other hand, I don't really see a major decoupling. The phrase people like to use is de-risking. So we're worried about semiconductors, that's one thing. But does it really matter of all the range of other things? Something that is no longer talked about, but you do have to think about the size of our current account and trade deficit, often approaching at times $1 trillion. And then you say, well, where does China or Japan or others have the money to invest overseas? Well, they're running big current account and trade surpluses. So that's something that has when Trump imposed the tariffs right across the board on so much of what we imported from China, well, people found other countries to buy it from. So it's really that question of a trade deficit is independent. It is something that, just as with the other deficits and debts that we have, we've got to think seriously about them.
What is the state of America's national identity and national purpose, especially on the global stage? Is America carrying out the role it has promised to and perhaps has carried out in the past? Are you confident in America's ability to continue doing so over the foreseeable future?
Well, I think we do face a challenge. If you go back to World War II, we had a national purpose. You went to the Great Depression. Again, almost everybody was touched by that. There was a national purpose. We needed to do something about that. And then in the Cold War, there was a shared national purpose. And I thought there was much of that same thing with regard to the economic challenge from Germany and Japan. Now you look and there isn't quite the same national sense of a shared purpose. I think we're looking toward one. I think for a younger generation, the whole question of climate change and the environment and a whole range of associated questions motivates them a great deal. But I don't think that's been yet a national challenge. It's coming, I think, I hope, but it's not there yet. We also, I think, need to rekindle the sense that America is the so-called city on a hill. And when you have a situation where there are still American kids that go to bed hungry, where there are still a lot of American kids that don't get the kind of education that they ought to have, and that's a loss for them, but it's a loss for the country as well. So I think we need to rebuild that tried, not that there aren't warts in our past. I mean, you can't talk about American history and the Civil War without talking about slavery. You can't talk about settling the West without recognizing the Indian Wars and so forth. But that's not all. I mean, I was just thinking of the recent Republican debate. We had 5 people left debating. 2 of them were of South Asian descent. One was an African American, then there were 2 white guys. I mean, that's an amazing, that would not have happened 10 years ago. So I think the standards that America set for itself, the whole Declaration of Independence, which is really emotionally and in practice part of our Constitution, we need to rediscover that. We need to remember that we have not measured up to what we wanted ourselves to be, that we have come a long way. And I think if you compare us to a lot of other countries, we're doing okay. But we still have that work to do. And I think, but going back to emphasizing that original mission and that sense of being a city on the hill, hopefully will be another unifying and motivating part of our future.
Well, Dr. Hughes, I think that's a great note to leave off on. I really appreciate you taking the time today to join the Cold War 5 podcast and to converse with me about these very relevant and important topics. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's been my pleasure.